Hello, I'm Elizabeth Karcher, and I'm the Executive Director at the Woodrow Wilson House on 2340 S Street here in Washington, D.C. I'm joining you actually for the first time of these talks where I'm actually physically in the Wilson House, which is really exciting news for us. We've opened the house for our staff and for our summer scholars, and so we'll be here not always. Sometimes we'll be working remotely, but we're able to be on site, which is the first time in a number of months, so we're very excited about that. We're also thrilled to have, we have some speakers today. We've got Eric Yellin talking about racism in the nation's service, and contrary to our other talks, we're going to have this one moderated by Brenda Jones. So Brenda is from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and you'll learn a little bit more about both of these just in a moment. So this talk is a continuation of our June noon Zoom. Now, of course, we're in July. We took a week off, and we have moved and shifted the conversation from women's suffrage to, given the times, we thought we would address racism. This is a very hot topic in Washington, D.C., in the United States. In fact, it's a hot topic across the globe. I went to Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, D.C. I posted a picture of myself, and I put out to my friends, if you were wondering what I was going to do at the Woodrow Wilson House about segregation and Wilson's legacy on race, tune in today. So I'm hoping some of my friends are here. I also get a number of questions from people saying, why are we always talking about Woodrow Wilson now? What has he done? What did he do? And why would that be of an interest in today with Black Lives Matter? So if you had either one of those questions for me, today's your day, and I'm glad you tuned in. We're actually very excited about the Wilson House. As I mentioned, we're talking here from the Wilson House today, but we have a number of other initiatives that are taking place at the Wilson House that we're preparing for this summer. We are launching a walking tour, which is self-guided for you to learn about Waddy Butler Wood, who was the architect of this house and other houses in the Kalorama neighborhood. That will be online very shortly, and you'll be able to download the audio, download the tour. We're also going to be presenting audio walking tours, which are coming soon. We have some people recording those that tour for us right now. We're also preparing something that I'm thrilled and excited about, which is also a Suffrage Outside exhibit, which will be launching this summer. It will be an outdoor exhibit in the Woodrow Wilson House garden here on S Street in Washington, D.C. So you'll have the opportunity to see our Victory Garden in the front of the house, and then you'll be able to explore the backyard, the back garden, which is actually one of the few remaining authentic Waddy Butler Wood gardens in Washington, D.C. It will be covering the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And so we're working on that now, and it's going to be quite exciting as well. So despite the fact that we're closed for tours inside the museum, we are trying to provide some really exciting programs and events, both online and in the garden and outside. So with that, I want to thank everyone who's joining. I'd like to thank people who, when they do log in, they make a donation. We are a 501c3. We are part of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We rely on grants and donations and generosity from our viewers like you and our visitors who come. And so we really appreciate if you've made a donation, and we were thrilled about the donations that came in June for our Suffrage Speaker Series. So I thank you, and if you like what you see, write us, tell us, and make a donation. That's the best way to continue this type of programming. With that, we're going to have Eric Yellin speak to us today, and Brenda Jones will moderate. After his talk and the conversation, we welcome you to log in and ask questions. You can put them in the chat. Right now you are, as you'll see, your screen is dark and you are muted. If you'd like to send in the message, please do. If you'd like to open up and have us see you participate later on, once the conversation is continuing, please log in, and we'd be happy to especially answer your questions when they come into the chat. Again, I'm Elizabeth Karcher. You can direct them to me, or to Brenda Jones, or in fact to the entire audience. So with that, let me introduce Eric. Eric is, his book actually is one of the first things that I found when I joined Wilson House. It's on the library shelves. Recently, we have rewritten our script and our narrative of what we cover in the house. And we've asked our guides, we have 20 guides who work at the Wilson House, and we've asked them to read, they have a curricula that they follow, and we've suggested this is one of the readings because it's so important to what our narrative and our discussion is about Wilson and talking a complete history of Wilson as the 28th president. So with that, this is Eric's book, and I will introduce him. Eric is at the University of Richmond. He is in the history of department. He's currently working on a book project that considers the political and social meanings of Social Security and how notions of employment, retirement, age, class, race were shaped by this interaction of state and society. The core query of his work asks, how did interactions between state and society shape American experience in the 20th century? Which is actually fascinating because it's a build on what his first book, which is Racism in the Nation's Service, Government, Workers, and the Color Line in Woodrow Wilson's America, examines, which is the federal employment as a lever and obstacle for racial equality and social mobility in the age of progressive politics. Spanning the period of Reconstruction to the 1920s, Racism in the Nation's Service reveals how the post-Civil War Republican patronage machine supported a growing Black middle class in Washington, D.C., and how, in turn, racial discrimination in federal offices during the presidency of the Woodrow Wilson administration implicated the United States government in the economic limitations for African Americans. His public writings have been featured in the Washington Post, USA Today, The Conversation, and elsewhere. And you can follow him on Twitter. Today we have, as I said, a slightly new format. We have Brenda Jones joining us. Brendan and I met each other at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, where Brenda is the Senior Director of Public Affairs. We started to talk because, of course, we had some public affairs issues and questions about how we would deal with Woodrow Wilson and his legacy. And I called Brenda to say, we need some help. And getting to know her, I realized that she is very, it's been a real pleasure working with her, and that she has just put out a book, a series of 4 books, which are terrific. The new books are finally out, The Queens of Resistance, quick, sassy bio celebrations of women blazing trails in politics. And I thought that she would be a dynamic guest today to be our moderator. So with that, I welcome Brenda Jones and I welcome Eric Yellin. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Brenda, are you muted?
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. Hi, Eric. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
Well, I thought that, well, let me do this. Let me give an overview of what we sort of talked about in essence, to kind of orient the audience as to how we're going to be looking at and unpacking Woodrow Wilson today. My thesis is that Wilson really represents the blind spot that is an inherent part of being American almost from the very beginning. We had this soaring set of ideals and principles laid out in an incredible document that we still look to today for inspiration, and people around the world look to for inspiration. Yet somehow we engaged in a system of atrocities to build a nation based on liberty and justice that was unjust and was brutal and was forced slavery. So from the inception, we had this dichotomy. And we today are looking at ourselves due to the protests that people have engaged in and the demand that we rectify injustice in America. We're beginning to look at ourselves and saying, am I part of this? Do I perpetrate this injustice? I think that my values are, liberal. I think that I treat people fairly. Yet somehow, maybe unconsciously, we are participating in a system that oppresses others. So it's great to be able to look back at a figure like Woodrow Wilson, who simultaneously erudite, scholar, philosopher, a profound thinker as it relates to foreign policy and the unity of world nations, yet somehow he was involved in resegregating, not just supporting segregation, but resegregating the federal government at a time after there had been progressivism in American politics. So that's sort of the backdrop for how we want to unpack this today. And I thought you had some ideas that you wanted to share with us to sort of get us into this discussion of Woodrow Wilson and who he is.
Yeah, thanks for that. And thanks for doing this with me. It's really an honor. I want to start with, there's so much there, but I want to start with and I totally agree that Wilson is a great place to start to think about ourselves, because there are words and there are ideas that we want to affiliate with, that we instinctively affiliate as seeing as progressive and future-oriented, and yet we get word we learn history that is disappointing, and then we think, what does it mean? And I think it's helpful to sort of get into the details and figure out where not only blind spots develop, but how we can actively, whether we mean to or not, exclude, right? The blind spot always means to me that we sort of didn't notice. And, there's, as we learn more about the story, and we talk more about the story about Wilson, it's more than not noticing, right? It took a lot of work to segregate the federal government, and it took a lot of people to do that work. And that's not, it's not accidental. So let's talk a little bit about what it means. So we hear this phrase a lot: Woodrow Wilson resegregated the federal government. And I want to take that apart and sort of think about, lay some groundwork for what that means or meant at the time. And the first thing is to start with that word resegregate. And I think it's really important to recognize that Wilson didn't resegregate the federal government. The federal government was not segregated after emancipation. It certainly was exclusionary and discriminatory, involved in supporting the terrorism and the violence and the labor exploitation of enslavement, certainly. But segregated implies a sort of, at the time, implied a kind of rationalized system where some people will be over here and some people will be over there, and that separation will clearly indicate inferiority for those who are aimed at for segregating, right? So we'll force people of color, African Americans, to be in one area and white people in another, and that's a kind of rationalized system. The federal government did not operate that way after emancipation, after African Americans earned citizenship and the right to participate in federal government. The first civil servant is a man named Solomon Johnson. He's appointed in 1864 by Lincoln, and he goes to work as a treasury clerk in an office and amongst everybody else in those offices. And he would be joined over the next couple of decades by more than 600 black federal workers who were not segregated. They worked throughout the federal government in federal offices in DC. So that by the end of the 19th century, there are actually about 3,000 African Americans working in the federal government. This isn't to say that there wasn't discrimination or racism or terrible encounters between employees, but on the whole, the historical record doesn't show formal segregation, does not show huge revolts by white workers about working with black workers or African Americans who were forced to in one part of an office. That it's just not in the record. What we find is a relatively, and relatively is an important term, right? Relatively compared to the rest of the United States, an office culture in which African Americans were hired, promoted, given responsibility, given supervisory roles, and really asked to use skills that they had earned either on-the-job training or in their educations. So it's not a resegregation. What happens in 1913 is a segregation, is a significant change in how these offices operated. Second part of that, Wilson resegregated the federal government, is the federal government. What does it mean? Who are we talking about? And a lot of people ask, were there national offices of the federal government? Certainly, less than today. Fewer offices of the federal government around the country than there are today, because you didn't have a social security system. You didn't have these sort of institutions that would go everywhere, but you certainly had a postal system. You had a treasury system that had offices and ports of collection all over the country. And so in those offices too, you don't see uniform segregation, even in the South. So you had African-American postmasters, African-American postal workers working in post offices all across the country without formal segregation. And then if we sort of narrow into DC, certainly if the federal government was primarily in Washington, and most African-American federal workers worked in Washington, but they worked at all levels of the federal government. So we're talking about folks who did work that had become associated with African-Americans, that is domestic labor and hard labor. There were African-Americans in DC doing that work for the federal government. There were also African-Americans doing white-collar work as kind of clerks, writing reports, doing accounting. The Register of the Treasury, who was essentially the accountant for the federal government, was an African-American for 4 different terms. That's a position appointed by the president. 4 appointed registers of the Treasury in a row are African-American. And then you get cabinet advisors, presidential advisors, people all the way at the top who have the ear of the presidency. And so what you have is, to talk about the federal government, is to really try to imagine lots of different levels and kinds of work. You've got chemists, you've got people working in factories, you've got, like, as I said, clerks, lawyers, economists, messengers, custodial staff. It's a world of work, the federal government, and there's lots of different ways of doing that work and lots of different pay scales. And African Americans populated every level at the turn of the 20th century. And then finally, go back to the beginning of the sentence. Wilson resegregated the federal government. We need to think about what Wilson's role was, what his involvement was. Did Wilson approve of segregation? Absolutely. Was he aware that it was happening in the federal government? Certainly. Was he involved in the day-to-day maintenance of trying to figure out where people would work and how to segregate these offices that were not segregated? Probably not. There isn't evidence that he was involved in the day-to-day work. There's lots of evidence that his cabinet members, in particular, his Postmaster General, Albert Burleson, who was a Texas politician, and Josephus Daniels, the Secretary of the Navy, who was a North Carolina politician and journalist. These are the folks who really made the policy-level decisions to segregate the federal government. And then its staff members below, right? Supervisory staff, people like the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, a man named John Skelton Williams, who really went by the sort of day-to-day work of walking through these offices and discovering, much to the dismay of Wilson's administration, that these offices were relatively equal employers, that African Americans and black men and women were working with white men and women across the government. And those interactions, that act of segregation, is something that's happening in offices, on the ground, and not necessarily with Wilson's sort of day-to-day involvement. The last thing I'll say, and then I know people have questions, and I shouldn't lecture too much, but is to think about this word segregation and what it meant to this world of work, this world of employment, and really this world of DC, in which African Americans could come and reasonably expect to enter this world of work, either through some kind of meritocratic exam or through connections, the way that most people get jobs, right? They know somebody. And what they could expect from that was decent, stable employment. Federal rules required firing with cause. Federal salaries were standardized. So when you got appointed as a first-class clerk, your salary was set at $1,000 a year, regardless of who you were. And that kind of fair employment, right, was crucial to Black life in DC. It funded capital investments in home ownership and businesses and entertainment, so that at the turn of the 20th century, there's a world of Black capital that is funded by people who go to work every day and take home a salary that they can count on and have a little extra over at the end of the week after they've done paying for their housing and their food for other investment. And that made a huge difference for life in DC. And so when we talk about segregation, that's in some ways doesn't capture what happened when the Wilson administration moved in and John Skelton Williams, the Assistant Secretary of Treasury, gave the order to the head of the Bureau of Engraving and Printing that African Americans were not to be promoted, right? That's not just about separation. That's not just about where you work and whether you'll be separated out. That's about whether your career will be allowed to proceed as you expected, as you have earned, and then that your salary will reflect that and your investment in your community will be available, right? And so segregation doesn't capture the pain of a $1,200 a year salary being reduced to $500 a year, right? A salary that is fixed at $1,000 in 1910 that doesn't go up for 10 to 15 years, right? And through the inflationary of World War I, right? That loss of capital and that loss of decent employment is really what we should mean when we say segregation in the federal government.
Well, it's fascinating to me as somebody who was born and raised in Washington, D.C., and is aware of the legacy, the decades of legacy that existed among African Americans. I mean, many of them came here just before the Emancipation Proclamation because D.C. had freed their slaves earlier than other states.
Right.
And so there is this tradition of liberation, a sense of independence and the capability to establish really the American dream, the American ideal to have, a house, a family, to be middle class, to send your kids to college. That, is one thing I want to convey to anybody who lives in DC and can then recognize the legacy that exists here and existed here, and actually that gentrification has worked to sort of diffuse, at the very least, if not nullify. So that's just one point I wanted to mention, that, this is part of the reason why there is this, there is a holding on, because there is among African Americans in Washington, because of the legacy of empowerment that existed here for more than 100 years. So that's one thing to note in what you're saying. The other thing I wanted to get to is why. Why was it important for Wilson to implement this when it didn't exist? And we're not talking about a huge, maybe the federal government seemed huge at the time. I don't know. Was it larger than some businesses?
It was the predominant employer in the city for sure.
But in the nation, did it compare to, say, what Cornelius Vanderbilt was, his factories, or, I don't know. But now, I mean, the federal government is a huge employer, larger than many, even international businesses. But I'm wondering why he thought it was such an imperative that, why couldn't he just let it be? Why was it important for him to implement this kind of strategy? And one thing I want to just bring out that surprised me, or that I didn't know, is that Wilson was born just before the Civil War. He was like maybe 5 years old when the Civil War began. He was born in Virginia and then moved to Augusta, Georgia. I don't know how that happened, but spent the Civil War and much of Reconstruction there. And so it's clear that during his formative years, when he was a child and a teenager, that this whole debate was raging, and there was a war on. And he, no doubt, was inculcated with a lot of ideas. So I just throw that in there as a backdrop to his consciousness. But why do you think it was so important for him to impose segregation in the federal government?
It's a great question, and there's two parts to it, because one is how did he articulate why it was important to him, and then why did others get involved in it? Why did others see it as important? And there's some differences there. For some, for somebody like Josephus Daniels or Albert Burleson, in some ways there is just shock, right? There was an expectation by 1913 that African Americans had been put in their place. When they arrive in DC and take over these offices in which African Americans work with responsibility, and we might even say power, it's really shocking, right? And so there's a kind of aggressiveness to their actions, because they just in some ways can't believe this hadn't already been resolved. I think for Wilson, this is what cuts to the heart of what you said at the beginning about how we understand progressivism, how we understand progress and liberalism. For Wilson, the word progress meant that the federal government, and as president, and when he's a governor of New Jersey, it can be the state government, whatever it is, the government can be a source of making people's lives better. That our conditions as human beings aren't preordained. They don't come from something beyond our control. That in fact, government can help make people's lives better. That's what it meant to be progressive in Wilson's era. And that's what defined progressivism for him versus, say, in the 1912 election against somebody like Taft, who's really not so sure the government is a force for good. Then the question becomes, what should the government do to make things better, right? So it's a progressive position. Then what do? For Wilson, and for a lot of the folks in his cabinet, segregation makes the world better because it brings order. Because it brings racial order and a clarity of white supremacy that will not only make sure that African Americans are not out of place, but will also properly employ those endowed with the kind of the ability to be progressive, to run a good government that can actually help people. For Wilson,
sorry. No, so you're saying it's embedded in this sense of inferiority. He's saying, well, these people are not capable, even though many had proven their capacity to work in these roles. But if these people are not capable, then it's disorganized for us to have individuals who are underperforming these roles.
It's not right, and it's not just disorganized, it is inefficient and possibly corruptible, right? So Wilson believed that part of progressive government was clean government, good government, corrupt government. So he's a long-time civil service reformer, right? He wants a meritocracy, he wants a public administration method that is efficient and transparent to the people. The public government should be liable to the public's observation, and therefore and clean in that way. This is where this word "clean" comes from. That the people are not corrupt, right? Go back to your point about Wilson growing up during Reconstruction in Augusta and Columbia, South Carolina. He's imbued with and becomes a teacher of the idea that what went wrong during Reconstruction was the empowerment of African Americans who, as Wilson wrote in his own textbook of U.S. history, who were not ready to be fully endowed citizens and participants in democratic government. And since they were not ready, since they were inferior, right? They could make mistakes themselves or be manipulated by evil people who want to manipulate them and make the possibility of good government, impossible. And that what happened in Reconstruction is that we empowered the wrong people.
Did he have any evidence of this? Because, what I have read of the Reconstruction, I'm definitely not a scholar of the Reconstruction, but I've heard some of these soaring, very profound speeches that African-American members of Congress made, and bills that they tried to pass and did pass. So where did his evidence come from for this perspective?
In the simplest sense, the evidence was that white Southerners could not imagine, did not understand the biracial world that they had created. And the evidence of something having gone wrong was that white people were not in charge everywhere, right? That was evidence for racists. That's evidence enough, right? Another piece of the evidence was the involvement of Northerners during Reconstruction of Southern governance, right? These foreign elements, as far as white Southerners were concerned, that their worldview was that those who were eligible, who were truly small d democratic, the people, and this gets back to where you opened, so much of this requires us to define what we mean by the people, right? If Jefferson is able to write these incredible words about what the people should be able to do, that the people are sovereign, they have a right to govern themselves, and then he can exclude whole bunches of people, you have to realize that he doesn't mean everybody when he says the people, right? And so in Reconstruction, what happens is you get, in places like Wilmington, North Carolina, a majority Black population with a majority Black government. That in and of itself, first to people who cannot imagine racial equality, is a sign of corruption rather than a sign of democracy. And so
regardless of the facts,
regardless of the fact that the majority has voted, the people have spoken, and they have elected people who represent them. And they are, the coup that Josephus Daniels, Wilson's Secretary of the Navy, is involved in undertaking in 1898 to violently take down a government in which African Americans play leadership roles, is nothing but violent, and not based on anything other than evidence that Black people were empowered. There's no evidence that Wilmington was poorly managed or was going bankrupt, or that white people were being abused. There were rumors of white women being attacked. They were, as these stories were almost always false, right? These are rumors and myths propagated on the idea that, look, if I look at the government and I see a Black face, something's gone wrong, right? And
And the thing is, we see those exact parallels today in this unwillingness for some of us who are Americans to regard science,
right,
to look at the facts, to the fact that we could be engaged in racist thinking that would empower, bring some people to power in the last election, and could be part of the next election, regardless of the progress that we've made, the evidence of capacity. So the interesting thing about what you're saying is that we can perceive from our reality now that some of these values still exist, regardless of what the facts show us. And that's a very profound thing about Wilson. The fact that he could be considered progressive. And I wonder when that began to shift, because today progressive politics really engages a kind of big tent philosophy. If you're progressive, you have to be including many different groups.
Yeah.
So when did progressivism shift to a point where it included the lives and interests of minorities in America? Do you know?
Yeah. So that's a really big question, and I want to just take two pieces of it. One is, it doesn't shift in one direction only, right? That to be progressive actually in the late 1860s and early 1870s did include African-American men. It excluded women, right? Women don't become part of the sort of political world until really, right, the right to 1920. But it did include Black men. The Republican Party included Black men. The Democratic Party in the North included Black men. So there was inclusion. It's not a sort of clear opening, right, getting bigger and bigger. What we see when we look at American history is opening and closing. And in the late 1860s, progressive did mean inclusion of African Americans. Part of what I think is so significant about Wilson's role here is that I think he's crucial to the narrowing of progressive politics and liberalism to exclude African Americans, right? He makes possible an exclusion And so what you see when you look at national politics in the 1920s, even into the 1930s, with some opening up, promoted mostly by Eleanor Roosevelt and advisors to Roosevelt, not necessarily Franklin Roosevelt himself, some opening up there, it's still a relatively narrow world of inclusion. African Americans are still easily excluded from New Deal programs, right? It's not on the table until really African American activists, right? What the sort of new wave of modern civil rights movement after World War II, that leading lawyers and also activists will put on the table and say, wait a minute, if the United States was fighting for democracy and pluralism in World War II, what about all us, right? What about millions of Americans who are currently excluded? And so that's what's going to happen in the 1950s, right? With a renewed push after World War II to force inclusion of African Americans in what it means to be American. That period between the sort of 19 teens and 1950s, right, is a period in which of exclusion.
So you're saying that this constriction lasted a long period of time.
It certainly did, so on our topic, you can see this in the way that Republican administrators talk about the inclusion of African American civil servants in the 1920s. Prior to Wilson's arrival, most Republican appointees recognized that African Americans were a part of the Republican Party, and that would mean that they would be part of the patronage, they would be part of employment that comes from political participation, that everybody was involved in, white or black. This was how employment worked in government. By the 1920s, previously inclusive Republican supervisors are saying, well, you know, it's inefficient to not be segregated, or it's inefficient to promote African Americans into supervisory positions. That language of efficiency, that language of good office management, is a language that comes from the 19 teens and that will get adopted by new supervisors and Republicans who had never talked that way prior to the 19 teens. So yeah, it will last for decades.
And it's this kind of pragmatism. I'm seeing a hand. It's this kind of pragmatism that is so dangerous. As somebody who worked on Capitol Hill for 16 years, what I saw was the engagement of these ideas that seem rational, like voter ID. Yeah. What's wrong with people having an ID having to show an ID when they come to the polls? But with some introspection and really looking at the issue, you discover that these rational ideas are really undergirding a racist strategy to disenfranchise and disempower. And this is where I think Wilson serves us, looking at what happened, what he did, how he did it, and what ensued after he did it is so important, because it demonstrates, number one, the power of the presidency. The president is important, a powerful leader. And if we put someone in there who is diametrically opposed to the principles of democracy, it can be spread like a cancer across American society and persist.
Yeah, I think words matter here, right?
That's right. Yeah. Well, I think some people want to jump in this conversation. I see Elizabeth,
we're having too much fun ourselves.
I came back on. This conversation is remarkable, and it's going very deep, and I'm actually thrilled with that. We did have some slides that I thought, Eric, you might want to share, and that could add a little bit to the conversation as well.
I was sure. When I was talking about this world of government work, it was documented at the time. Sometimes people imagine these things are somehow secrets, that I know something that nobody ever knew before, but people did know, right? So if we look at this is an image that W.E.B. Du Bois put together in 1906 for the Paris Exposition. He was given a little bit of room in the U.S. Exposition to say something about African Americans. And one of the things he chose was to show images of Black government clerks, right? And that's it's his writing underneath, have received appointment as clerks in the Civil Service, Department of the United States government through competitive examination, right? That these men looking very proper and dignified and distinguished were for Du Bois an indication of the promise of African American freedom and inclusion. That when given the chance, right, they can fulfill these roles in ways that they can be enormously proud of, and that the United States itself, remember, this is going out into Paris to the world, that the United States itself could be proud of these workers. We got to note that they're men. We got to know that they have a certain kind of respectability politics here, right? They're dressed a certain way. Certainly, Du Bois was aware of that, and we can question it, I think, and we should. Nonetheless, the basic message of the government service is a place of true citizenship and true participation. That's what this image was supposed to indicate. And then I have a couple of others that I think are sometimes surprising to people. This is a picture of John Abraham Davis. He's down here. I think you can see my cursor. Brenda, can you see my cursor there?
Yes.
So that's
I
John.
can see.
That's John Abraham Davis, who was an African-American clerk. And these are the people who not only worked with him, some of them worked for him. He was a high-level clerk in a supervisory position. And this is not a picture taken to document that there were Black employees or that there were Black supervisors. This is simply a picture of John Abraham Davis's office. And the reason I think this image is important is it really undermines a claim that Wilson and others in his administration made, that these offices that were inclusive, that were involved Black civil servants, were somehow torn apart by this inclusion or torn out and unable to operate. It's just simply not true. This was a part of life in federal offices, and people expected it. When you went to work for the federal government, you expected a workforce that actually looked closer to America than Vanderbilt's factories necessarily did, right? And so this is a world of pride for these employees. This is John Abraham Davis and his family. He owned some land in Virginia that he earned through having worked hard and worked his way up in the government service. And he used to talk about modeling himself after Theodore Roosevelt. And that's a deliberate look on his part, with the glasses and the mustache, because he thought that Roosevelt had an inclusive definition of democracy. We could debate that. Well, I think it's fair to say that Theodore Roosevelt was a racist too, but he did not impose segregation or limit the careers of Black federal government workers during his presidency. And for Davis, that was critical. I also show this picture because it's taken, I believe, in that Virginia land that he would have to sell to keep his children in school. So Davis's children, 2 sons went to Williams, his daughter went to Wellesley, paid for by that government salary. And when he was demoted from $1,200 a year to $500 a year, he had to essentially bankrupt himself to keep the family going. They did. One son went on to become a lead lawyer for the NAACP, who wrote some of the legal paperwork in Brown v. Board. And another son became the John Dewey Professor of Education at the University of Chicago. That family story is absolutely incredible, and it's a family whose story starts with the opportunity that John Abraham Davis had for equal and fair employment in the federal government. And it's a story, as Brenda was saying, that is known and told in Washington, but not necessarily beyond.
Well, that was the other thing. There are 2 things that I saw there. Firstly, demonstrated is the illogic and unscientific nature of racism, and how simple it is really for people to just get along, get together based on capabilities, belief systems, values, to connect according to who they are, how easy and simple it is, and how really complicated and unnatural, actually, racism is. The system that it imposes is harsh and unnecessarily, unrealistic. It is a superimposed reality.
It requires a lot of work. I mean, my favorite story of this is in 1912, Congress approved a brand new Bureau of Engraving and Printing, a brand new modern factory to make the nation's currency. And when the Wilson administration arrives and the building is finally ready to open in 1914, there's a letter from Joseph Ralph, who was the bureau director, up the chain to Treasury officials saying, hey, I don't know if you guys know, but the brand new modern factory that we designed a few years ago was not designed for segregation. It doesn't have segregated bathrooms. It doesn't have segregated locker rooms. It doesn't have segregated office space because nobody even imagined that the federal government would be segregated. So you guys kind of have a big problem if you want to segregate the new Bureau of Engraving and Printing. So what do? They go locker room by locker room, locker by locker, assigning people to individual lockers so that they can essentially impose, it takes an enormous amount of work and time, impose segregation onto this building that was never designed for it. They have to close bathrooms. They had to assign women to bathrooms that had been designed for men, so there are women complaining that there are urinals in their bathrooms. All of it is sort of sudden, rushed, and deliberate, right? And requires this effort. John Skelton Williams requires that letters written to Black employees be changed so that they don't have honorifics anymore. They no longer say, dear sir. They have to say, dear name. All of that took rewriting, took time, took effort on the system that wasn't natural to the institution that he was now running.
And the other thing we can gain from this is that racism is economic.
Yes.
It's not scientific.
Yeah.
It is economic, and it's about power and the reservation of power for a few individuals, and the unwillingness to compete on a level playing field. That is the real core reason for it. And the disempowerment, the economic disempowerment that has happened time after time after time to African Americans. So some people say, well, why can't they get it together? But what happens is, just like the mortgage crisis, for example, that occurred in our lifetime, where people are targeted, disempowered, and then they lose sometimes everything and have to start all over again.
That's one of the other problems with the language of talking about segregation, is that it imagines separation, right? This wasn't about separation. This was about setting aside a group of people so that they could be useful in one particular way, right? So they could do work. But only work that would not economically empower them. So sometimes we can look at the numbers of African Americans in federal employment, and the numbers actually don't go down in the 19-teens. Where they go down is in higher level positions and the supervisory positions and the kind of work and the kind of salaries African Americans were allowed to do. Custodial work, right? This job was known as charwoman. Essentially the women who came in and cleaned up these offices. Nobody had a problem with those women being Black because those positions were not socially or economically empowering. So segregation does not mean set aside and never see again. It means making people available for the work that you expect them to do, that you want them to do, and it doesn't threaten you.
So why don't we take a few questions? I know we're running out of time. Let me see. Let me look on the chat here and see what I can find. I'll try to start with the earliest ones first, if I can.
I can jump in, Brenda, and start with some of the questions. The first one.
Okay, please.
Yes, okay. The conversation was so good, I didn't want to interrupt. The first question that came in actually says, Eric, can you describe the circumstances under which the Wilson administration established an officers candidate school for Black servicemen?
Briefly, the people to ask are the really brilliant scholars of World War I and Black soldiers, Chad Williams and Adrienne Lynn Smith. But so I'll steal from them for a moment and just say simply that the establishment of that school was the result of enormous pushing by civil rights activists to demand it. The Wilson administration's plan for World War I and the mobilization that even involved African Americans, the idea was that they would not see combat, that they would not direct troops, that they would essentially serve as the kind of domestic labor that was imposed in federal offices in Washington, D.C. And the vast majority of African Americans who served in World War I, and they served in enormous numbers, they joined up disproportionate to their numbers in the population. They saw World War I as an opportunity to prove themselves. So they signed up in huge numbers, and the vast majority are put into essentially domestic labor, cleaning up or digging trenches. So there's the NAACP, William Monroe Trotter, Du Bois, I.W. Wells. There's a huge push for some kind of officer school. And finally, the Wilson administration relents, but only on a segregated basis, that they will only lead Black troops. And it's so late in the war that there's really not a huge empowerment of Black officers. And in fact, Charles Young, who was the most famous African-American soldier, having fought in previous American wars, including the War of 1898, was not given a commission. The Wilson administration would not empower him or African-Americans in that way. So it's really kind of a late effort by the NAACP that doesn't bear a whole lot of fruit.
Do you want to take another question? Or I know one thing I wonder, Eric, is the heart of our discussion. How could he hold these soaring ideals of, progressive ideals about international unity, peace, and also have this hostility and aggression against members of his own society? I know it's impossible in a way to answer that question, but from your knowledge of him, how would you say those two things coexist?
I think there's a couple of things. One is, again, this definition of who we're talking about. Well, who are the people, right? Who's eligible to be empowered in this way? And it is true that Wilson had a broader sense of who should be empowered than perhaps those who directed the British Empire, right? He did imagine that white people in Eastern Europe should have some self-determination. And that was a pretty radical idea. He did imagine that, the 14 points include support of the Russian Revolution, that those who were considered peasants should have some say in their government. This is Wilson the liberal, right? That poor people, that people who are farmers and are not traditionally part of ruling class should have say in their government. I think he believed that. Why he could not include people of color in that, and I say people of color deliberately because he did not include not just African Americans, but people around the world who did not sort of fit his vision of being eligible for the sort of what he called the Anglo-Saxon genius for governance. Right? He argues in his book, The State, that the Anglo-Saxons have a particular ability to govern. That is a kind of narrow view of who's eligible, and maybe it's failure of imagination. I think he was pretty ignorant about the world. I think it's his arrival onto the world stage is pretty shocking to him, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense in his biography, right? I really don't think he's has amazing rhetoric, but not a whole lot of knowledge. And it's part of why he struggled in Paris, because he dealt with people who knew a lot more about the world than he did.
Fascinating. So there is, even though he was a scholar, he was uninformed on some
He's
of
a
these.
scholar of Anglo-American politics, right, and history. He knew a certain kind of history about the Atlantic world from an Anglo-American, English and American point of view.
Well, it reflects to the isolation of the United States, the fact that we don't have contiguous borders with many nations that are different, and we're currently trying to build a wall on one of them. So, we aren't engaging difference. We don't have to, cross borders to work or to engage in, our daily life. It's a huge country. We are isolated, and so we're unaware of what is happening in the world. And I think that's something for us to recognize as Americans, that maybe other nations who are people of other nations who are experiencing and forced to deal with certain circumstances may be able to teach us something about multiplicity that we don't naturally understand because we don't have to manage it. We don't have to deal with it. And I don't know, do you want to take another question, Elizabeth, or not? Or are we out of time?
No, I have one more question that we have. What was Wilson's role in appointing Judge Terrell in the DC court? And was he rethinking his position with that appointment?
That's a great question. So initially, the expectation that African Americans would have certain presidential appointments was so great that Wilson initially entertains a couple of appointments of African Americans in 1913. This position I mentioned, this Register of the Treasury position, the Recorder of Deeds of DC, these were positions that had been held by Black politicians for a long time, and there was some expectation that that would continue. And Wilson actually puts forward a name for a Black Register of the Treasury, and he's quickly told by his fellow Democrats that this is a non-starter, and that man, Adam Patterson, is essentially asked to quietly step down, and Patterson's a kind of good Democrat, and he does, and so that appointment doesn't go through. Judge Terrell had been a superb judge in the District of Columbia for more than a decade when Wilson arrived, and his reappointment was understood within DC circles as a foregone conclusion, that he had deep connections within DC, enough that he could overcome the resistance in Congress and ensure that appointment. And so that's a really easy one. It didn't indicate a kind of change of heart on Wilson's part. What it indicated was that politics matters and political power and connections matter. And Terrell was deeply connected with enough of the right people that he could sort of be reappointed. But he really is, in some ways, the classic exception that proved the rule, right? That he was so, he had to be so extraordinary to keep a job that he had for, a decade anyway, that he managed to squeak through. But by 1920, so presidents had routinely appointed, including Democratic and Republican presidents, had routinely appointed more than a dozen African Americans to presidential appointments. By 1920, there are 4 Black men holding presidential appointments. So it's a significant drop. Terrell was one of them.
Do you have any other stories of loss, I wonder, about what's the most dramatic story of loss that you have after the segregation of the federal government?
So Shelby Davidson is a story that similar to John A. Davis, because what's interesting to me about Davidson is that Davidson was not just any clerk. He was a brilliant clerk who was an inventor and had invented a accounting and tabulating system for the Treasury Department, and had contributed to that vaunted notion of efficiency and office management that we associate with modern management that Wilson was supposedly trying to impose. And Davidson was a highly respected, highly paid clerk, and he's demoted. He had trouble with his eyes, and he's repeatedly put into offices with low light deliberately to try to make life uncomfortable for him. And so it's an incredible loss, I think, to the federal government. Davidson himself was so brilliant that he sort of figured out how to move into a career within civil rights. He'll become an officer in the NAACP. His son went on to Harvard and came back to DC and was involved in the DC NAACP. And so he's sort of, and then eventually his son will work for the Roosevelt administration, Franklin Roosevelt administration. So he sort of survives. But to me, the loss is taking that mind out of government service, right? What Davidson had been able to accomplish as a clerk is pretty remarkable. There's Charles Hall was a Census Bureau clerk who was really the first to sort of notice the Great Migration, because he had been assigned, essentially his work life had been narrowed to, you're only allowed to count Black people, essentially, right? That's part of the segregation of the Census Bureau under the Wilson administration. So he was a brilliant census official before that, but he starts focusing on African Americans, and he starts writing letters to his supervisors. A lot of people moving. This is 1915, 1916. The numbers are going down. There are labor is becoming less available. There's a labor loss, for employment loss in the South. He starts tabulating these numbers, and he's really the first to notice what will become, a world-changing event, right? The migration of 1.5 million Black Southerners north in that period, and then 5 million during World War II. And Hall is essentially run out of office. He's no longer able to sort of be this kind of pioneer in the Census Bureau.
We are just about out of time, so I thank you both so much. Just make sure I'm not on mute any longer. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Brenda. Many of my comments that have come through have said, "Can we do a part 2?" So we'll have to talk about that, because we still have a long list of questions that would like to be answered. So I've taken pictures of them, and we'll have it, and we'll see about having both of you come on again to speak. I want to make a statement, which of course Brenda helped us write for the National Trust and for the Wilson House, and just a part of it, to make this very, very clear. The National Trust and the Wilson House take our responsibilities seriously as stewards of this house, the Woodrow Wilson House. An honest appraisal of history helps us understand ourselves as a nation and as a people. We do not hide these facts, but see them as an opportunity to assert that Black history matters, and that we, as historians and preservationists, must be determined to share the truth of history, even when it is not complimentary to us. This is why we believe interpreting Wilson's legacy in an inclusive, multicultural, multi-generation way is so important. Wilson's ability to seek international peace on one hand, yet sow the seeds of domestic terror on the other, is important for Americans to understand, because it exemplifies some of the same blind spots we still struggle with as a nation today. What is most important is that we as Americans learn from the successes and failures of history, so that our future can be better than our past as we build an ever more inclusive and more just society. So with that, I thank you very much for joining today's Zoom with Eric Yellin, moderated by Brenda Jones. And tune in next week, we'll have another talk. Thanks.